Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 21st of April. Today we're discussing the Ukrainian withdrawal from Novomykhailivka and recent Russian advances around Novokalynove and Ocheretyne. Before I do that though, I want to talk about the fact that the House of Representatives yesterday they passed the aid package, the $95 billion bill that had been stalled for 2 months in the House of Representatives by Speaker Mike Johnson. So basically, on February 13th, the Senate they passed their $95.3 billion aid package, and in the 2 months since then, Speaker Mike Johnson did not put it up for floor vote in the House. And in that time period, he tried to balance competing interests in a way that he could create his own iteration of that aid bill that could actually pass through the House of Representatives, because surely it will not pass to the Senate and get signed by President Joe Biden. And so Johnson spent the past 2 months stalling and then trying to work out a way in which he could get all of the competing interests to converge and agree to pass this particular bill. And so what he did was he took the foreign aid package, he made several changes to what the Senate had actually passed to the House, and then he split up the $95 billion package into four different bills. And each one of those bills was voted on individually. And he did this so he could get the various different factions within the House to agree to vote for whichever part of the legislation that they felt most strongly about. So, just as an example, you have a lot of people, especially in the Republican side, that were particularly interested in voting for the Israel bill that gives about $17 billion in weapons to Israel and replenishment for the United States within the Middle East. And so a lot of Republicans that are more skeptical of Ukraine aid, they ended up supporting this piece of legislation. And then on the other hand, you have some Democrats that are more on the progressive side that are opposed to some of the Israel spending, but they did support the voting for Ukraine aid and also for Taiwan support. And then you have some Republicans again that are more skeptical of Ukraine aid but did support the TikTok ban, which is a part of the fourth section of this legislation. So there's three pieces of legislation related to funding aid. And then there's a fourth bill that Johnson added in that is supposed to act as a sort of sweetener measure to get support from additional factions, mostly from the right wing side, but you could say not the Freedom Caucus side. Some of the Republicans that might be on the fence about supporting aid to Ukraine. This was supposed to sort of put them over the edge and eventually supports the entire $95 billion package. And so it included sanctions on various Russian and Iranian figures, included what has been discussed for a while now, which is banning TikTok. And the way it would be done is basically going to their parent company, ByteDance, and telling them that they have 6 months to end up selling TikTok to a different company. Actually, it's in 9 months. So basically, in the original legislation related to the TikTok bill, it was 6 months, and now it's been increased to 9 months in this particular bill. And then President Biden, he would have the authority to extend the period of time that ByteDance would have to sell TikTok by another 90 days if he sees that they're on the process of, selling it. And so that was included within the same package. And so after they were all voted on individually, they got combined together again. And then in that vote, again, the $95 billion package ended up passing. And when you look at the individual packages, you could see the trends for which members of Congress supported certain legislation and which didn't. For the most part, you had most of the centrist and more established wings of the Republican and Democrats supporting all four pieces of legislation. Then, as I said before, you had members of the Freedom Caucus, especially. I guess there was like a core 30 members of that general, more anti establishment Republican side that opposed Ukraine aid, and they were also aided by another 70 Republican representatives that are also opposed to such aid. And so you could see the votes. You could see actually more Republicans opposed the bill relating to Ukraine than supported it. But then, of course, it changes a lot when you go to the Israel bill, where most of the Republicans voted for it. Some of the Freedom Caucus members and libertarian minded Republicans voted against it. And then you had, again, progressives voting against it as well. And then in terms of the Indo-Pacific and Ukraine Democrats, they were basically voting in unison. No opposition from the Democrat side for those two bills. Now let's look at what's particularly mentioned within the bill, especially relating to Ukraine, which is what you guys are most interested in. You'll see that the first point is something that Johnson added in, and it was a way to sort of like compromise with some of the Republicans. And this basically took all of the financial economic assistance that Ukraine received from the US and turned into loans. So now the US is given $9 billion in additional loans, which are supposed to help with Ukraine's economy, especially. And they will be given in the form of loans that could be forgiven by 2026. And this is something that, again, wasn't included in the original Senate bill. Another thing that was added in by Johnson is the fact that now Biden and the presidential administration, they have 45 days to publicize a specific strategy that has laid out goals, objectives, and ways in which the United States could advance forward and pursue its interests in Ukraine. And so this is something that again is meant to sort of like get Republican support. It's not something that really is that substantial in terms of like changing American policy. It's just a way of gaining confidence from Republicans in the House. But it will be interesting to see what Biden lays out because so far we haven't received a unified plan from the administration about what they're really looking to achieve in Ukraine. Because for over the past year, all we've seen the Department of Defense do is give out every couple of weeks or every month or so these presidential drawdown authorities giving out these like 300 million, $500 million aid packages to Ukraine over an extended period of time. And we haven't really gotten a good idea of the end game. But in any case, it also does have more emphasis, at least in name only, because of course, what's said in a bill and what ends up getting implemented in reality is usually very, very different. But at least here, Johnson, again, trying to get support from the Republican side, talked about more oversight, including with in person monitoring requirements for the weapon systems and the aid that gets pushed to Ukraine. And then in terms of what actually the Ukrainians will be able to use, that's about 13.7 billion. So then the Ukrainians could use that to buy the weapon systems from the United States. But for the most part, and it says it here as well, 79% will go to funding the US defense industrial base, which still does have an impact on Ukraine. It, of course, does have an impact on the Department of Defense's stockpiles because the Department of Defense has really suffered from large shortages due to depleting a lot of the stockpiles and ammunition that they had originally giving it to Ukraine. And so this is important because it will now allow those stockpiles, especially in Europe, to get flushed with additional equipment, and then eventually that could be sent to Ukraine later on. And so it does still have a certain impact on the Ukrainian side. And so here you can see 13.7 billion to replenish the American defense stockpiles, another 7.3 billion for American operations in Europe, and then again procurement, nearly 14 billion for advanced weapon systems. And it also talks about this rhetoric about paying fair share for European countries because again a lot of this has been done to pander to some Republicans that ended up voting in favor of it and allowing it to get pushed over the edge. What's really important to note is how long will it take Ukraine to actually receive these systems. So it's probably going to be the case that midweek the Senate passes this bill, and then Biden says that he's going to immediately sign it. And so the American facilities and storage bases that are located in Europe, they're trying to prepare for that scenario, trying to get whatever artillery systems, particularly 155 millimeter shells, getting them ready to be sent to Ukraine. And so there's a lot of different estimates coming out about how long it will take for those to actually reach Ukraine because in previous cases where Biden used the presidential drawdown authority to pull various systems from stockpiles and then give them to Ukraine, it sometimes has taken several days. But there are other estimates that I've seen from the mainstream media that are estimating that it could take several weeks for a substantial portion of the shells of the artillery guns. The artillery guns are going to take much longer than the shells, for instance, for other ammo, for air defense systems to actually make it to Ukraine. And so there is a short period of time, which could be several days or several weeks, where Ukraine will still not have access to the full abundance of these systems. And that's time period that the Russians are likely going to exploit to conduct additional deep strikes into Ukrainian territory, especially because Ukraine is suffering from a large shortage of interceptors for Patriots, for instance, and for other air defense systems. And so I think we're going to see a continuation of the deep strikes that we've seen over the past week, for instance, on Dnipro in the coming end of April. And just to quickly go over the rest of the bill, there is $15 billion in aid going to Israel, which includes about $5 billion to the Iron Dome, David Sling, which is like longer range missiles. Iron Dome usually focuses on shorter range, unguided missiles and drones. And so they're going to be replenished after over 6 months now of trying to intercept rockets from Hamas and Hezbollah. And then you have 1.2 billion for the Iron Beam, which is interesting because we haven't really seen that being used yet by the Israelis. But the Iron Beam is supposed to be a much lower cost alternative to the Iron Dome, which could be used to supplement it in times where the Israelis don't want to waste a lot of money on firing a Tamir interceptor. And the Iron Beam would do usually the same job as the Iron Dome, but only in the proper weather conditions. And then, of course, you have a lot of money, 2.4 billion, going to replenish American stockpiles, or 4.4 billion to replenish American stockpiles that were then given to Israel, and then another 2.4 billion to help the United States continue with its own stockpiles, its own military resources within the Middle East, especially as it expended a lot of money protecting Israel when Iran a couple of days ago launched the missiles and drones towards Israel. And then you have 9 billion in worldwide humanitarian aid. That's weird because I would assume they just say Gaza aid because it's under the Israeli bill, and most of that's probably going to go to Gaza specifically for building the port that the United States Navy is constructing, and perhaps to some other aid agencies, might be like World Central Kitchen. But it specifically says that none of the funds will go to UNRWA, which is something that was also included in the Senate bill, I believe. And that's about it for the Israel bill. There's also the Taiwan bill, which again, 8.12 billion, a lot of it going to provide Taiwan and other regional allies like the Philippines with offensive weaponry, advanced technologies. You have here development of submarine infrastructure, investments in dry docks. You have again strengthening American capabilities in the region and replenishing the various stockpiles that have been depleted over the past years in this region. So that's 2 billion. And then the final bill, which is the sweetener bill that I talked about, and sanctions on Iran, sanctions on certain technologies that could reach Iran, that could then be used in drones that they're constructing. That's one thing. Putting sanctions on Russian oligarchs, and then actually the very interesting part of this is that it authorizes the Repo Act, which means that the United States will now seize the frozen assets that they have under their control, which amounts to about 5 billion of assets from various Russian businessmen that they, had in the United States. Now the U.S. will be sending that to Ukraine. I believe there's about $300 billion of Russian assets that were frozen by the EU and G7. And so those have not yet been sent to Ukraine. There's still a lot of like economic and legal challenges relating to it, but the EU is trying to find a way where they can try to take the profits from those assets and send it to Ukraine. So that's still in the makings. And then there's again TikTok and various other measures relating to China. Then the border bill, which is a bill that was supposed to at least be tied to the aid bill, but eventually this was not something that came through. So now this border bill, which the Republicans were really pushing for to be included with the four other bills, it is actually being voted on separately. And last night it was voted down because although they had a majority of the votes in the House, it did not receive a 2/3 majority. And so for now, any sort of border compromise or any sort of measures related to restricting the flow of illegal immigration will not be possible, and it will not be related to whatever gets passed with the 95 billion bill. Okay, now let's talk about the front lines. There was a minor change recorded yesterday to the west of Solodka, where the Russian forces got control over this particular fortification system. I'll mark it with the red rectangle as always. And so this is a reversal of some of the Ukrainian advances that occurred over here in late February. But further north, this is where we see the most important changes. As per Deep State yesterday, the Ukrainians have withdrawn from the vast majority of Novomykhailivka. They might have some presence on the outskirts, for instance, around these western houses leading into Paraskovivka, but for the most part, they left the dachas over here and the area around the fishing pond. And now the Russians are pushing in this direction and clearing out the houses and trenches that the Ukrainians set up. And this is something that was also echoed by Ukrainian sources as early as like 1 or 2 days ago. And Russian sources were also saying something very similar, that after weeks of the Ukrainians being holed up in the western sections of Novomykhailivka and putting up a very fierce resistance, they eventually decided to withdraw. And you could see really why eventually they were forced out, simply because they continue getting bombarded every single day by FABs, by artillery, and it was on a very concentrated piece of land. And so here's just one video of that I have marked on my map, which shows TOS 1A shelling of the Ukrainians in Novomykhailivka. And this was just nonstop for over a week now. And so eventually those infantry squads were pushed back, trying to hold the line now around Paraskovivka. But the reason why they held on to Novomykhailivka for so long is because now the Russians have a direct route to pass by Paraskovivka, of course, attack it as well, but also to get to Konstantinivka. And from there, Konstantinivka, you unlock control of a road junction that goes in four directions. It could go north to get the Ukrainian bulge and the fortifications in this direction, could go further westwards and get control of the rest of this valley on which the Ukrainian defensive nodes are located, which includes a lot of key villages further westwards, leading to Ospenivka and Kurakove on the southern Donetsk front, and also going southwards towards Vuhledar. And so that's why the Ukrainians, specifically the 79th Air Assault Brigade, held on for so long. And a couple of days ago, 79th, they started pushing out a lot of imagery relating to the battle and sort of a recap of the battle, which was again an implication that they were about to lose the village and wanted to try to remind everybody of what they had achieved while defending. And so they released a compilation video showing 314 Russian vehicles that they claim were destroyed. A lot of them were definitely destroyed, and I'd say the vast majority are probably Russian systems, because the Russians definitely did launch many armored assaults over the course of the past 7 months, especially from the southern direction, but also from the eastern direction through these fields towards Novomykhailivka. There were very few Ukrainian vehicles that were involved in the fighting over here. Some may have been involved in localized counterattacks, especially on the northern flank, but it's not any substantial number. And so the vast majority of those vehicles are Russian and were either damaged or destroyed. And so it gives you an idea of how the Ukrainians, especially utilizing their drone systems from the Shadow drone units, were able to spot the Russian vehicles and destroy a lot of the columns. And also, the second largest factor was the fact that there were just vast minefields in these various fields that the Russians were advancing on. But in any case, it wasn't enough. 79th, they try to frame it as a David versus Goliath story, because they said that they were facing 30,000 Russian soldiers during the battle, which is not true based on what they were saying, because they claimed that there were 10 brigades involved in attacking towards Novomykhailivka. But at the current moment, you can measure about 4 brigades that have some of their elements, at least, not even all of them, fighting in the Novomykhailivka area. So you have 39th, 155th. This is the main brigade doing most of the infantry assaults at the moment. So that's a singular brigade. And then you have a few others over here. These are actually regiments. There are some regiments that are a part of brigades that are fighting. And so that's an even smaller unit. And then you have, I believe, the 57th over here. So yeah, you do have about 4 brigades that are generally located in the area. And throughout the course of the battle, of course, there were various other units, but it was never more than like 5 that had some of their elements, smaller elements involved in the fighting. And even at the time, they had others that were fighting in Marinka or further south, like around Mikilske, Vuhledar. And so it's not accurate to say that there were 30,000 soldiers just pushing forward the entire time. What is true is that likely the Russian forces did have a 3-to-1 advantage if they have around 5 brigades in the area. because you could say the Ukrainians had around 5,000 forces from the 79th and from other units that were sent to hold the line, and then you have around 5 brigades, which is equaling around 15,000, 16,000 soldiers. So the Russians likely had a 3-to-1 advantage, or maybe a little more, plus the ability to rotate their forces out, which is the key reason why they succeeded, because the 79th Brigade did not receive any sort of proper rotation during the battle. And so that's the main reason why, but also the 3-to-1 ratio is good for overcoming Ukrainian defenses despite all the losses. Around Heorhiivka, Deep State on the 19th of April reported a Russian advance, minor advance, that got control of additional fields to the north of Pobieda and also control over this particular trench. And so, in terms of the extent of that gain, I guess you could say it is about 1 kilometer in its extent, or a bit more than that, 1.5 kilometers westwards. And looking a bit to the north, the Russian forces have now solidified control over much of southern Krasnohorivka, and this comes after 5 days of Russian tanks, including the turtle tanks, advancing through the gray zone towards the Ukrainian lines, dismounting infantry in areas that were thought to be key Ukrainian strongholds, and then gradually solidifying control over strong points. And so that's what's been going on this past week, and it allowed the Russian forces to get control over this southern residential area where previously they'd been pushed out. Now they have control over it, and there was no Ukrainian counterattack. Ukrainians they still have positions in some of the western portions over here, but that's about it. And then a bit further north, the Russian forces have control over much of the rail station and some of the houses and facilities to the north of it. And so for now, it appears that the Ukrainians, they have a line. I wouldn't really call it an organized line, but they may have some forces still located around these various factories in central Krasnohorivka. And if that's not the case, and further north, they probably have some squads located in these various apartment buildings that give them a good view of the battlefield. But in terms of elevation, the Russian forces definitely have an advantage now. They control about 10 to 15% of the town, and the areas they do control that are marked in this particular color, these two polygons, it's located on a ridge which runs a bit from the southeast, and it basically goes like this. I'll measure it with two parallel lines. The Russian forces have control over this ridge, which runs through southern Krasnohorivka in the same area that the rail line is located on, in the same areas that the Russians have now captured, and overlooks the rest of the valley on which Krasnohorivka is located, which is marked in this green rectangle. And so the Ukrainians do have the height disadvantage, not just within the residential areas, but also in the trenches located to the east. On the 19th of April, Deep State also reported that this section of the trenches that is located to the north of Novelske is currently a gray zone, which is basically implying that the Ukrainians withdrew from this area. And if the Ukrainians withdrew from this particular area, then they definitely withdrew already from these trenches over here and any other tree lines they previously been holding in this bulge, which is a rather large swath of fields, which now the Russian forces are in the process of clearing out. And so the line will shorten, and the Russians will have control of additional fortifications before making their way to Netalove, which is still under Ukrainian control. Now, moving on to Ocheretyne, this is where we have some very important developments. So, starting on April 16th, that's where we received the first information from Deep States. They've been breaking a lot of news regarding this front. They talked about how Russian infantry was actually able to infiltrate the southeastern outskirts of the town. And then we got on the 18th of April verification of this based on Ukrainian drone footage showing first shelling. So there was Ukrainian artillery shelling of Russian infantry as they were making their way from the rail line, then crossing towards the trench that was set up by the Ukrainians. And the Russians successfully stormed it, but then were shelled by the Ukrainian side. And so that was confirmation of the Russian advance. And then at the same time, 2 days later, on April 20th, there was a video released by the Ukrainians showing their drones dropping grenades onto Russian infantry located within those same trenches, but also in houses that are located further west. And so for 2 days, there was a fierce battle with the Ukrainians trying to organize their forces. And when you look at the force composition, you have the 115th Mechanized Brigade, a unit that had not fought for really a year because they fought in Bakhmut. They lost a massive portion of their battalions and of their troop composition. So they've been refitted to the best of their ability. And it appears that once they were sent back to the battlefield, they were inept in holding the line, and that's why the Russian forces were able to achieve a penetration. And so it appears that this unit is now trying to reorganize and hold the Russians at the eastern outskirts, and they may be receiving support from nearby units like the 47th Mechanized Brigade or some territorial defense units. And so there was a back and forth for 2 days where the Ukrainians also put pressure from the northern flank, trying to push the Russians back out. This was not enough to actually get rid of the Russian breach or penetration, you could say, this bulge that was created. And the Russian forces eventually got control within these houses. And now they have a permanent presence over here. And the Russians, they are trying to further strengthen their hold on the outskirts of Ocheretyne by pushing from the northeast in this direction with the red arrows. And so they're trying to get control over the eastern flanks. They're doing this by overrunning Ukrainian positions in open fields and tree lines in subsequent trenches. And so Deep State also admitted the Russians were able to advance. I'll show them the area they advanced in. They were able to advance at most 900 meters through these open fields in the area to the north of the rail line over here. And this is very important because it gives the Russians, first of all, additional heights under their control, because all of these fortifications that you see in yellow that are built north of the rail line, that I guess I could go over in red, those are located on hills that are overlooking Novokalynove and Keramik. And that gives the Russians an additional height advantage because those two mentioned villages are on rather low elevation. And at the same time, it gives the Russians equal height parity and a vector of attack to reach the various larger Ukrainian defense nodes that are set up in between Ocheretyne and Novokalynove, in particular this one over here. At the same time, the Russians are now putting a lot of focus on getting control of Novokalynove, and this is again in order to protect the eastern flank of the Russian garrison that made this breakthrough towards Ocheretyne. And so we saw the Russian forces per Deep State and per Russian sources advancing along these two roads like this, and they were able to get an advance about 1 kilometer to the northwest along this particular direction. This is the extent of the Russian gain, because previously they were located on the outskirts of the town, and now they've been able to penetrate hundreds of meters inside and get control of some of the houses. And this shows the evidence of that. There was Ukrainian footage showing shelling of Russian infantry once they made it to the houses. And some of the areas taken under Russian control include areas where previously the Ukrainians had sent in tanks and were defending against the Russian advance. So that includes this forested area over here that is now in the gray zone. And so all in all, the Russians are putting pressure on two vectors, and that is now allowing it to close in on Novokalynove, Keramik, that are located on valleys. So holding onto those positions will be very difficult, and losing them will further embolden the Russian forces to solidify control in this region, which will put Ocheretyne in danger and all the other trenches that were built by the Ukrainians surrounding it. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.